Spelling is a cosmetic feature of a language. Okay, this is really important to get clear because I think the way that we learn English in school gives us the impression that spelling is an essential feature of a language, right? How much time do we spend in grade school on spelling, right? And the spelling test and the spelling bees, and which have their own sort of social rules and dynamics to them, which we few I take most of us here to have been nerds as kids, and rather than jocks or athletes, maybe with the exception of Darren, who probably straddled both worlds since he's an athletic coach. But most of us were nerds, and so the spelling bee was like the one competition where we had the edge over the jocks. And as opposed to dodgeball, which was created to torment us nerds, right? And things of that nature. But there was definitely a great deal of pressure that I felt coming into the spelling bee, because it was like, this is the thing I'm supposed to be really awesome at. And so if I don't do well here, if I don't win here, then what use am I in this world, right? I can't make the football team, and I can't spell, and what's going on? All of that left me, at least, with the impression that spelling is this super fundamental part of grammar. In fact, spelling is no part of grammar whatsoever. Spelling, it belongs to orthography, that is to say, the correct way to write a language. And orthography is external to grammar. It has nothing to do with the grammar of the language. Now, in order to make this point, I said this on a Latin Facebook group a couple of weeks ago and got some pushback from a dude who named the Cambridge Dictionary and, quote, other reputable sources in his argument with me. So I'm pleased to report to you that I laid a suitable scholarly smackdown on that nonsense. But that's not the point. But it did make me aware that, if you're just casting about in quote unquote reputable sources for ways to think about spelling in relation to grammar and whatnot, you're going to encounter a different take than what I'm offering here. So I just want to take a moment to motivate it so that you can understand where I'm coming from with this. So the first thing to understand, of course, is that no natural language, and we only really care about natural languages. So I just say that to cover my butt, but now I'm not going to make that distinction going forward because we're just talking about natural languages. No natural language, that is to say a language that comes about naturally rather than being crafted in a laboratory like Esperanto, no natural language begins with writing. In fact, it is not the case for any natural language that writing is either earlier than or contemporaneous with the development of the language. Writing is always subsequent to the development of a natural language, right? And this makes sense because no one sits down to develop a language. The language develops organically out of communication situations. No language, no language we have any access to thinking about is ex nihilo. Every time any language we pick, any language whatsoever you like, has an antecedent linguistic history that we either do or do not have access to, but none of them just sort of drop down fully formed from the heavens or anything like that. And so when we speak about language, we're only equipped to speak scientifically about languages that have come from another language by a process of natural development, according to which speakers of that earlier language gradually came to be able to understand themselves while speaking what counts as grammatically a different language. Okay? So, of course, writing isn't earlier or even contemporaneous with that because no one's got the intention of making a new language. And so if the language you're coming from already has a writing system, then you're just using that one. And if it doesn't, why would you invent a writing system at this point when you're engaged primarily in beginning to use the language in more unique and different ways, such that it's changing into something else? Okay. Well, the proper way to define the boundaries of a language, and what I mean by the boundaries of a language is this: how do you know when they've stopped speaking Latin in Italy and started speaking Italian? Right. Traditionally, it is accepted that the first text that we have that is Italian and not Latin is St. Francis's Canticle of the Creatures, right? The Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon poem. And when I was taking Italian at Yale, the teacher brought that in one day for us to look at. And we're looking at this thing, and I'm like, this is the easiest thing you've ever said before us because it's half Latin, right? There are all these things that everyone else in the class didn't know what was going on, but I knew because I recognized them for Latin. And yet, these sentences were not Latin. They weren't obeying Latin grammar. They were being constructed in a way much more like what we would consider to be modern Italian ways of speaking. So how do we know, where's the boundary between that text being a Latin text versus that text being an Italian text? And the appropriate way, according to linguists, and I think this is absolutely right, to fix that boundary is according to the grammar itself. It's not primarily whether someone who's a native speaker of the original language can understand the developing language, because that's always going to give you a massive gray area. I mean, people, I was in a hostel in France, and there were some Italians there, and there were obviously French speakers there, and then there was me. And I mentioned before, I was sat at this table where I was expected to do some simultaneous translation between the Italians and the French folks, and I discovered that simultaneous translation is not my gift. I was useful, but it was also, I was only about 50% useful, because there was a lot that they could say in their native language and just be understood by the others because of the closeness of those cognate languages. And so it's actually a pretty non-specific and non-scientific way to try to fix that. What we're looking at is if you imagine Latin grammar as a what kind of geometrical figure? Let's just take a circle, because circles are cool. If you imagine the Latin language as a circle, and in the center of this circle, there is sort of what we would call orthodox Latin grammar, right? Maybe we'll go ahead and give the classicists their due and say that it's classical Latin grammar. I think that's probably giving them too much, but whatever. As the language changes, it pushes away from that center toward the edges, right? And at a certain point, it crosses out of that circle. And when it crosses out of that circle, it ceases to be Latin. Now, the idea is wherever that grammar is, as that dot moves, that dot is always a center. So there's always a circle centered on it. So for a long time, you've got two circles that are coterminous. And then you get circles that are not coterminous, but there's massive overlap. And as it moves, there's less and less overlap. You might think, so, okay, at some point, you're eventually going to have two circles where there's no overlap at all. And this is where you have the situation where someone who speaks Latin, Spanish, French, or Italian, Italian, Spanish, or French, has to learn Latin in order to understand Latin, which is the situation we have today. So the question is, at what point in that moving from being coterminous to being two separate circles, are they different languages? And what I want to suggest to you is that it's when the midpoint of the circle crosses outside the circumference of the first one, that's when it's its own language. Now, okay, that's a cool analogy, but that's still not specific. What does that mean? Well, what we're tracking, what these circles are representing, they're representing the grammar. And so what this midpoint shows you is the center of gravity for the grammar. That is to say, the fundamental Sprachgefühl, the fundamental sense of language that controls how the grammar is being deployed. And as that goes further and further distant from where it started, let's say as Italians, Sprachgefühl grows, or that which will become Italian, goes further distant from Latin's Sprachgefühl, you wind up with different choices being made grammatically because they're following the logic of a different sense of the language. They're following a different intuitive idea about how to make meaning with these structures. So really what we're looking at is it's almost a percentage game of what percentage of the grammatical structures are falling apart. And once you cross a threshold that is, you could arbitrarily say like 50%, right? When the grammar is like 50% changed, then it's a new language. But actually the threshold is quite a bit lower than that. The threshold is probably more like 25 or 30%. Because if you change grammar 5%, that's gonna have a massive cascading effect through the entire system of communication that the language is. So by the time you change the language 25%, major different choices are being made. At that point, you still have a subjunctive, but what the subjunctive is understood to do has completely changed into something else, right? And so the Italian, French, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese notion of the subjunctive is radically different to the Latin notion of the subjunctive. Okay, so this is all cool linguistic philosophy, but where are you going with this? I'm going here. The language comes about by a process of grammatical drift. And at a certain point, we always recognize that a new language has formed post facto, or to use Scotus's phrase yesterday, a posteriori, after the fact. we look back and realize that, man, we ain't speaking Latin anymore, right? Um, at that point, whenever there's a recognition by the linguistic community that this circle has taken on an integrity of its own, then the development, the movement of this center of that circle away from the original center accelerates. Because before, it was always being dragged back towards that center by a conservative principle and by curmudgeonliness. But now, freed from the belief that this is a form of Latin, those ties are severed, and Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese are all free to go and find their own center of gravity wherever that happens to lie, however much or little overlap that leaves them with the Latin language. Right. So now here we are speaking a new language, and now we've become aware that we're speaking a new language, and now the question of how to write it comes into play. Okay. So that's one reason why to talk about spelling as a cosmetic feature of the language, because at the time that we come to start thinking about spelling, before spelling, at the time we come to start thinking about writing, the language has already come into existence, right? And so the things that have to do with orthography can be no part of grammar if the existence of the language is determined by the grammar itself, precisely because the existence of the language predates any system of writing for that language. Okay. Now, so here's the cool thing. That's all sort of philosophical, theoretical, abstract stuff, which is like where I live. But now let's turn to historical look at this thing. And there's another aspect to spelling that we need to realize, which is that the notion that spelling should be standardized is neither self-evident nor early. Right. There's the intuition that, hey, wouldn't it be great if we all wrote words the same way? Or even it's necessary that we all write words in the same way. That notion is not as fundamental to the linguistic culture as we English speakers raised in a system of spelling as king would naturally believe. What's important for spelling is actually not, historically speaking, what I mean by this is, in the West, what actual people have considered to be important in spelling is not that we all do it the same way, not that it be standardized, but that it be perspicuous, that it be intelligible, right? And so what this means is, for the longest time, diutissime, people wrote down what they said phonetically. The spelling represented how they pronounced a word, which means that if we were to do that today, between some of us on this screen, we would spell some words differently, right? Some of us say roof, and some of us say roof, right? And in fact, there was this ad that always ran when I was living in Texas. Everything down there in Waco was called Syntax, which is an abbreviation for Central Texas. And I think they liked it because of the abbreviation, but also because it sounds like kind of quasi-sciencey and cool syntax. And so there was this company that worked on the tops of houses, and it was called Syntax Roofing Systems. And they had this ad where they would say, talking about your roof, and they pronounced it roof. And this Syntax Roofing Systems, you're a hometown roofer. And I thought, that's interesting. And they don't just pronounce the word, every derivative of the word, the ing, the masculine performative ending, they're so committed to that pronunciation that they keep it all the way through those. They might spell that with a U instead of with a double O if they were spelling it according to pre-modern spelling conventions. Because what would be important about the spelling is to communicate to you the sounds as they hear them. Okay, so this is one of the ways that we know the sounds of medieval Latin as compared to those of classical Latin, is because we can see the ways in which the spelling changes to reflect the way they're pronouncing things. Likewise, it's another way that we know about regional variance in pronunciation, as you're going to see here. What we've been reading has been a very Central European way of pronunciation. The center of gravity for this lies somewhere in the midpoint between Paris and Rome, which I think is actually Milan. And there's a big university at Milan whose specialty is law, right? Whereas at Paris, the specialty is theology, and at Rome, there's the Pope. the more you go off of that axis, that Paris to Rome axis, whether you're going into Germany and getting into the sort of woodlands of the Black Forest of Germany and Austria, or you're heading into the Iberian Peninsula and crossing the Pyrenees, or you're going across the English Channel and going off into the islands that way, the more you begin to see phonetic variation in how they are pronouncing Latin, and you'll see that reflected in the texts. So that's a long way of saying that what we're going to see in this Wycliffe is a snapshot of what pronunciation in England looked like at Wycliffe's time. And what's interesting is that it was considered no barrier to understanding by anybody else outside of that dialect, nor was it considered to be a sign of lesser education or anything along those lines. However, you did tend to get it was somewhat distracting for someone trained at Paris to be reading some of this stuff, and so manuscripts that come from the continent will have a tendency to kind of normalize that spelling. And by normalize, I mean domesticate it, turn it into their version of the spelling, not into what you might consider standard spelling, because there is no such thing. Standardized spelling is the last thing. Spelling is the last thing to get fixed in a language, right? First you get the grammar, then you get a system of writing, then you get a system of spelling, and then you get agreement about how to spell words. And traditionally historically what has happened, is that spelling gets fixed by some particular authoritative text. So in Italian, it was the Divine Comedy. In French, it was the Song of Roland. Middle English spelling, Julie, have you noticed this actually? There's a great deal of increased normalcy after Chaucer compared to before Chaucer, right? I mean, it's like all over the map before Chaucer, and then Chaucer's like this funnel that everything doesn't just set it entirely, but it really narrows things down quite a lot. And Piers Plowman, it just kind of doubles down on that, right? Like, okay, now we're really set now. And you know what's interesting though, for modern English, for Spanish it was Don Quixote. Sorry, no, it was El Cid, the Cid. For English, modern English, spelling didn't really get fixed until Webster's Dictionary. Before that, you see wide variation in spelling all over the place. It's very uninspiring, right? They've got, other languages have these great works of literature, these epic poems showing all these incredible things. For English, we got a dictionary. But you can't pick your parents. Sorry. Right. So that's a long introduction to what's going on here. I really like having this here, both because I like Wycliffe, and I obviously never read this text, so I got no idea what's happening. That's going to happen in a second here. But also because it's a good chance for you to practice this, because I can't know that you're not going to have to pick up something to read it that's going to be whack in its spelling. So this prepares you for that. The rule of thumb with language, therefore, one corollary of everything I've been saying is that in language, always follow the sounds, right? How it's written doesn't matter for understanding how that word came to be, or what the dynamics of the pieces of that word are. Always follow the sound. This is another reason to sound things out, because some things that look really different when you see them on the page, once you sound them out, actually sound very similar, and it makes the history of that whatever thing is you're looking at a lot clearer.